Thank you very much, Brian, and great to have so many online again this evening. Thanks to all those that came along last week, and for those that are new this week, great to have you with us. As Brian's kindly introduced, we have 6 of these training sessions, so we're on the second one. So last week we covered the sort of what is a local place plan, and today we're going to rattle through the who, where, when, why, and how. Now, part of the how will also be supplemented in the coming week sessions, but we'll certainly get started on that this evening. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So just by way of introductions, again, for those that weren't with us last week, my name's Chiara and I'm a director at Imaginif.space. We're a social enterprise, and I'm joined this evening by Paul from Place at the Table. So I will introduce ourselves in a little bit more detail, just so you know who we are. So Imaginif are a small social enterprise that cover a range of different consultancy services, such as local place plan guidance, community engagement, facilitation, CPDs, so a little bit of everything. I'll now pass to Paul to introduce himself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul. I run Place at the Table. I have a background in community development and spatial planning. I'm a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and I've run probably 10 to 15 community action plans and supported lots of communities with different training over the last 6 to 7 years, and now also facilitate local place plan training. So you could come to us if you wanted to for project management, facilitation, writing policy statements for your local place plans, actually writing the plans themselves, coding the data, training, mentoring, and mediation and facilitation. So Chiara and I work together a lot, and we love training people. So it's just a real privilege to be here. So as Chiara mentioned, this is the second of 6 training sessions of this particular batch. This is the second part of an introduction to local place plans. So the first part, the link is going to be put in chat. We'll send out an email tomorrow. Really, these 2 sessions should be taken as a whole. We'll also send out a questionnaire to see what you thought of them. And then weeks 3, 4, 5, and 6, we're going to be looking in more detail at particular parts of the overall process that you might need to take in order to deliver a local place plan. So tonight the questions are who, where, when, why, and how. Obviously, because this is an intro, we're just going to be touching on each of these relatively briefly, but hopefully clearly, and ticking off all the things that you really do need to know at the top end of stuff. So, for example, tonight you may be coming with these kind of questions. When is the final deadline for local place plan submission? Is it actually when the council says it is, when they give out the initial deadline? Or is it another point in the process? We'll talk about that. When are the key moments we should connect with the council? Are there any opportunities to address their opinions of what they've taken our proposals as, whether they've accepted them to go into the local development plan or not? Can we choose the boundary of our plan? Do we have to say everything about every site or every place in our community? How much chance is there that our proposals will be included in the LDP, which is a kind of, is it worth doing question? And how can we be sure that the local authority won't just pop the plan on a shelf and it gather dust, which is also a why should we do it question. So we'll come back to all of these a bit later. Chiara.
Yeah, so we thought it'd be helpful just to recap what a local place plan is. So a local place plan is an expression of a community's aspirations which can influence local spatial planning policy. And there's 2 key things that it can do. It's about setting out priorities to regulate future development in an area, but it's also about helping communities to develop and deliver their own projects. It's also important to kind of reference that it can also be a hybrid document with elements of a community action plan, and it's really covering all the issues that are in your place that needs to thrive. And if you refer back to week 1's recording, that'll kind of go into a bit more detail again around what the differences are between local place plans and community action plans. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So the first question we've got is, who does a local place plan? So next slide, thanks, Paul. So it's always good to go back to the legislation and remind ourselves about what it says. So Regulation 3 of the regulations state that a local place plan must identify the community body who prepared the local place plan. And everyone might be wondering, well, what is the community body? How is that defined? Well, the definition that is provided is either that it is a community control body within the definition of the Section 19 of the Community Empowerment Act, or indeed it's a community council established in accordance with the Part 4 of the Local Government Scotland Act 1973. And I think the majority of people on this call are from constituted community councils, so very much in the camp of being able to call themselves as community body. But we're going to talk a little bit about obviously the community councils can be a community body, but it's not necessarily just a community council's role to undertake a place plan. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So a lot of plans are developed in lots of different ways and with lots of different groups of people. So Paul and I have had experiences where it has been solely community council led. But I think a really important thing to think about is the steering group that's associated with your local place plan, because just having your kind of community body being the community council to sign it off is really good, but actually having those wider range of insights and experiences can be really beneficial to the process, and also helps kind of spread the load, but also reach a much wider range and demographics and audience within your community. So we just wanted to also add in this slide about things to think about when you're creating or thinking about establishing a steering group. So one of the first things to consider is that, as I say, the steering group is wider than just the submitting community body to increase that local credibility. So it's seen as not just one group's thoughts, but actually a much kind of wider range. The second thing to have a little think about is that many communities are making it clear that several local groups have shared responsibility for developing this plan, and really that nominated just one to formally submit it. So again, that's kind of similar to the first point in saying that it's really setting out that there's been multiple ranges of organisations involved, to bring in those different insights and kind of share that responsibility about what gets put forward in the final plan. Point number 3, a good size is generally between 6 and 8 people, and we found that just from experience of working with groups that are both larger and smaller than that. But between the kind of 6 and 8 is a sweet spot, and obviously that's going to depend on the scale of your place. So it may be that a smaller group's more relevant if you're from a smaller area, or vice versa, but generally that feels like a manageable number of people to kind of keep up the momentum, share out the various tasks, but also get a kind of range of insights. And that kind of ties into then point number 4, which is really thinking about that variety of skills and backgrounds and maturity and experience. But we're going to talk a little bit more detail around that as part of the project management training session next week. Point number 5 is around the steering group, will be the core group that works up and decides the proposals for the draft and final plan. So whilst through the process of carrying out a plan, you will engage with your community in whatever way you see fit, but it's ultimately the steering group that really agrees and decides what goes into that final plan in acknowledgement of analysing and taking on board all of that wider feedback within the community. And point number 6 comes into that: be confident to take that position. But also there is mechanisms for acknowledging and submitting dissenting views so that you can kind of showcase both sides of the coin, and it's for the local authority to then review both of those sides. And again, we'll kind of talk on that in a little bit more detail in subsequent weeks as well. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So that was a little bit on the who, and again we can take questions in the Q&A to go into more detail as required. But next up is the where, and again we touched on this a little bit last week. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So under Regulation 3 of the regulations, it requires a local place plan to contain a map that shows the land to which the local place plan relates. And that really is for the community body to decide and define, what is the boundary of your plan. And that can be a range of things. So I think if we click onto the next slide, Paul, we can talk about those different options. So we can think about a boundary being a community council boundary or settlement, which you'll all be familiar with for those that are community councillors on the call, the area that your community council covers. So that's quite often used generally as local place plan boundaries. Another option is to have a single site. So indeed, a local place plan doesn't necessarily have to be an entire settlement. Um, Option C there is for it to be a ward or a district. So that may be several areas coming together, particularly if they're smaller or seen as a sort of collective. Even if they're out with one single community council boundary, they may view that it's actually effective to basically have a much kind of wider local place plan, which covers a range of places. But I think with all of this, it's important to state that the boundary really comes back to managing your own expectations as well as around what is actually, and not even just expectations, but also your capacity. Because if you look at the ward and district scale, that's a much kind of bigger, complex thing to coordinate as opposed to your community council boundary or indeed a smaller site. And the final one we have there is several local sites. So it may be that it covers several specific sites. So as you can see from the range of options there, there's not a one size fits all solution, but it's really important that it's the community body that chooses the boundaries of the plan. And then a couple of things to also note is that the plan doesn't have to be comprehensive and say everything. Local place plans are about setting out those kind of hooks and strategic points for you to then develop projects and proposals in the future. And it's important to really match your ambition with your resources. And that can be really challenging because we all want to do the best possible thing and most complete possible thing we ever can. But unfortunately, we've got to just manage those expectations and capacities, particularly as a wider steering group sort of context as well, and making sure to check in on everyone as you're going through. Relationships with surrounding areas are also really important. So if you are, and again, involved with your neighbouring community councils, that's really helpful. I know of some that have kind of forums and others have more informal relationships. But again, we would suggest that when you're looking to develop a local place plan, it's really kind of good practice to get in touch with those and just let them know, because it may well be that they're also developing one at a similar time, or if they've not, they might have already done one. So it's always good to kind of check in with your neighbours around that. And really just that final point around the strategic priorities. And again, this is maybe one to pick up in the Q&A a little bit more. But really your local place plan is, as I say, there to create those hooks, whether that's to inform the council around your position with various policies or land allocations and uses, but also just more widely to be able to help you to leverage funding, or also just really making visible what is currently invisible in terms of having a community voice that is kind of graphical and mapped. So I'm going to now pass over to Paul to take us through the next couple of points.
Okay, so question 4. When does a local place plan have to be submitted, and when are the key dates that you want to keep in mind? So just a reminder that a local place plan, what we're trying to do is influence the local development plan that is being created for your region. And the local development plan takes a long time to produce from beginning to end, often 4 or 5 years. There's a document that you can look at for every local authority planning department. They create what's known as a development plan scheme, which is released every year or so, that explains how they intend to take forward the local development plan process, and show you the times and dates where they think the key moments are. So you can download that for your particular council. And so the local place plans are an attempt to influence that. So if we want to know when, we have to think, well, there's this wider process. But there's actually it's not quite as straightforward as you think when it comes to thinking about the when of submitting a local place plan. So here's a brief overview slide of how a local development plan is produced. So there's an evidence gathering stage, a plan preparation stage, and then the delivery stage. Now we're just going to focus on the first two just now. Lots of councils will be working towards what's called the gate check, to check in with the government that they've created and got the right information to get themselves on the right track to write their local development plan. Imagine you are writing your master's thesis or something like that, and you want to go to your supervisor and check in that your plan to write that is okay and is on the right course and is in the right direction. That's basically what's happening at the gate check. It's an early check by the reporter to say, yes, go ahead and do the bulk of the work to create the actual local development plan. A lot of authorities are saying that you should submit your local development plan before they create the evidence report for the gate check. So the evidence report is basically their document that they submit to the reporter. That's very early in the whole process. And that's because there's a document, Local Development Guidelines 2023, Development Planning Guidelines 2023, that says that that would be a good time to get local place plans in, okay? But there's no requirement that that happens. It's just an indication, it's just guidance. And elsewhere in that document, it also says that you can submit a local place plan at any time. And what that means is that you don't necessarily have to submit your local place plan on the date, the indicative date that your local authority has put out to you, which could be before the evidence report. But actually, you could submit your local place plan a bit later in the process. I'll explain that a little bit more just now. So here's the legislation and the guidance. So this is from the 2022 Local Place Plan Circular. I've put a link in the chat. So as it says here, and it's also from the Local Development Planning Guidelines 2023. So it says here, LPP should be prepared in advance of the finalisation of the evidence report. Actually, local authorities only have to say to the reporter, we have advertised for the local place plans can be done, and here's how we've tried to give information and support to communities to do it. They don't actually have to have local place plans in at that moment. It could help them, but my advice to all communities is not necessarily stay in touch with your planning department and let them know what you need. Do you need more time? Do you need to not put a huge amount of pressure on yourselves to meet that particular deadline? Discuss it with them and invite them to allow you to have more time. And the reason for that is that in the same document, it says LPPs have to be taken into account in preparation of LDPs whenever they are registered, meaning whenever they are registered before the proposed plan is finally actually written. So here's the thing, between the gate check and the moment where the planning authority will submit their draft proposed local development plan to their own committee, planning committee and councillors, can be up to 18 months or 2 years afterwards, after the evidence report. So there could be, in Argyllshire, for example, they've asked people, and I understand why they've done this. So, and there's a huge amount of work that has to go into these things, but they've asked community councils to put their local place plans in by the end of June this year. But it's clear from their development plan scheme that their local place plan, their actual proposed plan won't go before committee until the end of 2027 at the earliest. Now, I would argue that you could still legitimately have put in a local place plan spring 2027 and still expect it reasonably to be assessed for inclusion in the local development plan, which is fully 2 years after the deadline they've actually only indicatively suggested. So be really careful about this and be aware that there are other opportunities to submit at different moments during the process. That's helpful. What it basically means is try and do it as early as you possibly can, but there is a pressure release valve, and don't hold yourselves if it's affecting your mental well-being. So hitting the indicative deadline that your council may have put to you in the first instance. Talk to them about it. Okay, just one other thing to say, or two more brief things to say. There is going to come a point in the process when the local development plan is put before committee at the end of the proposed plan stage, And the council's going to sign it off, and then they're going to put it out to consultation for 3 months. But when the planning authority lays this before the council, what they should be doing is also writing an explanation back to all communities that have submitted a local place plan, saying why or why they haven't included the proposals they've put forward. What this means is there's an accountability built in. You'll be able to see their reasoning. You'll be able to see the proposed plan and which of your proposals has got in. And then you're going to have 3 months to also feed back your comments on the back of that to try and influence the council again. That's a really important moment. Another key thing to remember is that whenever you do submit your local place plan, try as early as possible, so before you submit, certainly maybe 3 or 4 weeks before you do, to get in touch with your local planning authority and run the draft past them and say, look, is this ticking all the boxes, and will you register or validate this? So stay in touch with your department and talk to them so that you don't get any surprises when you do submit. And also remember, it's not a win-fail situation. When you submit your plan, if there's something that's not quite right and you haven't submitted all the elements and jumped through all the hoops, they'll just come back to you and say, you've missed a bit. Can you just add that in? You won't be knocked back. You'll just have an explanation and you can pick up afterwards. So the next question, why even do a local place plan? Well, you can do a community action plan. You can do all of that. You don't have to ask anyone or justify it. You just have to work with your community, come up with your proposals, and then advocate in cases of service delivery from the local authority directly with the local authority. But as we said last week, local place plans an added string to your bow. The opportunity here is that for the first time, community councils and community bodies that qualify are able effectively to write the proposals that they would like to see applying to their local area, and also submit in an easy process any development sites that they actually have plans for as community groups or within the community. So you might be thinking that your development trust wants to bring forward some affordable housing, where you could put that site, your proposed site, into your local place plan, and then that will be assessed for inclusion in the local development plan and de-risk, if accepted, your development, because you'll know that you will have planning permission in principle. But equally, you could put in proposals about trying to regulate development in certain ways, such as expanding your conservation area or including new environmental designations. But here's the thing, there already exists a powerful document called National Planning Framework 4, which we mentioned in the first session, but that contains nationally applicable policies. There are 33 of them across 3 different topic areas: sustainable places, livable places, and productive places. If you haven't had a chance to look at this document, I'd strongly recommend it. We will be doing a session, the 6th session will actually be digging into this document for your benefit. This is the document to turn to connect your ideas to the national level and draw justification and reasoning in policy terms to support what you want to say. So here's the idea. Basically, remember that here's what I always say: if you want a crystal ball to know what the next local development plan will look like for your particular region, you can look into a crystal ball right now and see the core of the plan. Because since 2019, National Planning Framework 4 is the local development plan for your region. Forming a local development plan now is about making contextual to your region the policies in National Planning Framework 4. So you already know the very heart of the next local development plan. That's quite a powerful moment for community councils, because what you can do is bring your big brother to help you out. So you can take the national policies, link them to your own local vision and policies and ideas and proposals in order to influence in between the regional level. You can say, here's what we think locally. This links to the national policy framework. So please accept our proposal and tell us why not, even though we've already explained to you that it fits well within the National Planning Framework for structure. So that's quite powerful opportunity. So another way is to think about it like an avocado. So this is my avocado image. So NPF4 is the core, is the nut of the avocado. That already exists. Local authorities are growing the flesh around NPF4 of their local development plan. And in a way, for your area with your local place plan, what you're trying to do is explain sort of what the boundaries and limits and framework should be for your local place as the local development plan gets filled out. I hope that makes sense. So all of this, why is it important to, why do a local place plan? You could get, for the first time, a locally written policy for your own place could potentially gain statutory weight within the local development plan, which is the document that controls development in your area. That decision is in the hands of the local authority planning department and your councillors. But ultimately, it could happen. You could see a locally written policy actually become part of the local development plan. And even if it doesn't become part of the local development plan, it will remain on file on a public register that must be accessed and looked at as part of an assessment by any development planning officer looking at a site-specific application that comes in after your local place plan is submitted. And they must treat your local place plan and any proposals that refer to this site that they're assessing as a material consideration. And your planning committee, if it gets to planning committee, can also place weight on what you've said in your local place plan. Now, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to get what you want. If you get it as a statutory policy, it would be very powerful. But even if not, because planning is discretionary, it could well be taken into account still. So that's first time that's really been able to be done in such a transparent, open, and consistent way across the board. So just as I come to an end for this bit, couple of frequently asked questions going back to our first slides. How much chance is there that our proposals will be included in the LDP? Well, the guidance says the weight given to elements within an LPP is for the planning authority to decide. So you could get everything that you put in your local place plan. You could get nothing. More likely, some of your proposals will be taken forward, some of them won't be, and you'll get an explanation why or why not. But it's the spatial or proposals that are to do with development that will be most influential. So if you put other CAP projects in, like forming a youth group, that's not really a planning matter, so it won't really be taken into account. If you want to set up a building or build a building, then it will be, because it's about development for that youth club. How can we be sure the local authority won't just ignore the plan? Well, local planning authorities must give clear reasoning supporting or not supporting any in LPPs when they put the proposed plan before their own committee. So you should get clearly detailed stuff around that. Chiara.
Thanks, Paul. So we're just going to round up this second part of the first sort of introduction to local place plans, talking about the how. But this is just going to be a very kind of high level overview because we're going to touch on that a lot more next week in the project management session. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So in terms of kind of key stage and milestone moments, for want of a better way to put it, we kind of summarize them into 6 different sort of milestones. So the first one being foundations. So that's really kind of getting under the skin and understanding the baseline information that is available. So that could be if you've already got a community action plan, it could be reviewing that. If you don't, it could just be reviewing other kind of plans or even projects that have been done that might be relevant to your place. So that's really understanding your kind of existing context. The second milestone we've got is engagement. So that's really kind of going out wider to your community to get that first sort of gauge of, you know, what are the likes, dislikes, and there's a whole range of different tools that you can use for that. And again, we'll kind of touch on those in the project management session. But that's really a moment for you to go out to your community and find out what's going on and where they want to see change. We then move to the third stage, which is analysis. So that is where we then take all of that engagement information and go through it. And that can be done again in a range of different ways. We quite often use the Place Standard tool as a framework to ratify where comments come in. It may be that you've used that as a tool for surveying. As I say, there's lots of different ways to do it. And again, that'll be maybe something that comes up in the discussion either in the Q&A tonight or certainly in the subsequent weeks. Once you've got that analysis piece done, it's then around developing that draft. So what coming through the analysis are the kind of key themes that are emerging? What are the proposals that are kind of local place plan related that can be pulled out of that? Is there things around existing policy that need to be looked at and reviewed? Is it about allocating new sites? There's, again, lots of different ways to kind of pull that apart or unpick that. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Section 5 or stage 5 is then around the information notice period. So that is a period where you, within the legislation, you have to go out and send your draft local place plan to your neighbouring community councils and local elected members. Um, and again, during that period, we often like to get that out to the wider community too, and often run a survey. And the critical thing for that is it runs for 28 days. So that's a kind of statutory thing. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the project management session. And then you get the final submission moment. So that's when you've got everything, you've done your information notice, and that is submitting it to the local authority. Next slide, thanks, Paul.
There we go.
But as we are going to chat about most of these little milestones in a bit more detail in the project management session, we just thought we'd share some top tips stage by stage this evening. So that first foundations stage, developing milestones but staying flexible is really important. So when you begin your local place plan, actually setting out, okay, over how long have we got? How long a period do we have in terms of when the deadline is or how much capacity your group has? That's going to vary group by group, place by place. But it's really important to try and set that out. So that's why we've kind of loosely recommended these various stages, because you can begin to actually map and program that out. And relationships are really key as well. So getting the ball rolling with, for example, local landowners early on in the process can be helpful, because we all know overnight some of these things take time and they don't just happen overnight. So if we can try and can deal with some of these things right at the beginning, that can be really helpful. In terms of engagement, try PlaceCheck or Padlet as free consultation tools, particularly when we are thinking about the sort of where question. And both of those tools are mechanisms for people to add pins to a map, so you can add comments. And again, happy to chat a bit more detail around that in the Q&A if it's helpful, but both of those are worth checking out and having a look at. And then in terms of the analysis, early discernment of what is a CAP project versus a local place plan proposal can be really helpful, particularly if you're kind of short on time. Actually saying, okay, do you know what, we can't look at the CAP stuff just now, but we've got all of the information, so we're going to park that for just now and we're just going to focus on the local place plan. That can be a really helpful exercise, and we've certainly done that with quite a few groups recently. And then next, in terms of developing that draft piece, just having expectations, of consensus, and using systems like a finger voting among the local place plan steering group can be really helpful, because to build consensus with the whole community is obviously going to be challenging, but actually within your steering group that's putting together the place plan, that can be really important. Google Slides or PowerPoint in terms of marking up maps are also a really good way in terms of using open source things that don't necessarily cost anything. And again, happy if you want to reach out to us to talk about that in a bit more detail. And then in terms of the information notice period, we often use Google Forms just as a way of capturing if people have are in agreement with proposals, have concerns with proposals, things like that. A simple, again, open source survey tool. And then finally, using a validation checklist upon the submission process just to make sure everything's being kind of ticked off, and also really access your support of your council officers as well. We've worked with many of them and they are really helpful and they are genuinely there to help. And then just a quick note before kind of pulling together the end of tonight's training session, just to note that if you are looking at mapping options, Paul has recorded a mapping for local place plans presentation, which he did for Argyll and Bute. So that may be of use if you want to find out more about mapping. Next slide, thanks, Paul. And yeah, so just to say, next week we are focusing on project managing your local place plan. So we'll kind of go through those stages in a bit more detail and kind of give you some hints and tips on how best to manage that. And before we finish, next slide, thanks, Paul. Just a quick note to remind you of some other useful resources that are there. So whilst we're doing these 6 sessions, there's also other guides that are available. There's other sort of webinar kind of conversations that you can see people who've been through the process, learn from them. And also there can be some really useful local authority guides as well. So I think that wraps us up for this evening, so we can allow some time for questions and answers. But yeah, thank you very much.